In this collection of pictures I will cover disassembly of a 1991 Polaris Fuji 488 fan-cooled snowmobile engine. This as a result of an engine seizure which gave little if any advance notice. There is quite a bit of info online, and I recommend you do your research there in conjunction with this video. The snowmobile simply stopped on the trail and I was able to restart and go about 100 feet farther, but that was it. By manually turning on the primary clutch, the motor would turn somewhat in one direction only, but it felt like it was binding against something. Basically, I figured it was a piston skirt and/or ring seizing to the cylinder wall, and we began the teardown. It is handy to have help, and my brother would be lending me his assistance. We both have mechanical experience and will wear our safety glasses. To start with, remove the air filter on top of the air box, and then the top of the air box followed by the bottom of the air box. The two parts are held together by metal clips which snap off and a screw on either side of the lower box. Turn your gas off and drain each carburetor by placing a small cup under it and removing the 17mm plug in the bottom of the float chamber. Replace the plug and loosen the clamp holding the carburetor to the rubber boot in the engine. Pull the carbs out of these boots and set them where the air box had been. Now locate the oil pump and remove the main oil line that comes from the oil tank and plug it. Also remove and plug the two oil lines that feed the cylinders. Stabilize your hood because you must remove your exhaust, which has a steel cable holding the hood threaded through it. Eventually I would find it handy to entirely remove my hood and nose cone. The steel cable has a spring pulling against it. Remove it only after supporting the hood. Use a vice grip to firmly grip and remove the exhaust springs, but a spring hook tool is safest. Note: make a drawing or take a picture of anything and everything to assist you in reassembly. What you think you'll remember, you won't. All small parts and fasteners segregate by what part they go with, bag and label them. Any bolts of differing lengths position on a piece of cardboard, showing the position it goes in reassembly. Now I'm ready to begin shroud removal. Remove top, rear, and front shrouds. The cylinder heads are next. With a marker, mark each cylinder head and lower block right and left from you being seated on the sled relationship. Also, mark the position of the larger head bolts that accommodate the shroud bolts. There are 4 of them. With the heads off, you can now see if there is damage or stuck pistons. I saw neither, so remove the 4 base cylinder nuts and see if the cylinder blocks will slide off the pistons. They do, but if they hadn't, I would have tapped on top of the piston while lifting on the cylinder block and possibly oiled the cylinder to piston area. If this had been the problem, you would be where you need to be to fix your sled. You could use a needle nose to remove the piston pin clips and a piston pin removal tool, which you can make, to force the pins out. Be careful of the pin bearing and inspect them. You may reuse, as I will, a good piston and rings, but if they are damaged and the cause of the seizure, you'll need the cylinder block possibly bored and honed, new pistons and rings, and then you would reverse this disassembly procedure. As you will now see, we must remove the motor since we've yet found our problem. Remove the recoil starter shroud and just let it hang where it is. Remove the 4 engine mount fasteners. The left front fastener needs a crow's foot or a custom wrench to remove. I will show you the wrench I made later. Now the engine is ready to remove. Protect the pistons so they don't damage themselves or the gasket surface. The speedometer cable is threaded through the motor mount, so you must remove it. Once out, use a harmonic balancer puller to remove the flywheel. You can use the recoil shroud bolts for the metric bolts necessary with the puller. Tighten this down and tighten the center puller bolt. Put as much pressure on it as you easily can and tap smartly with a hammer. The flywheel will pop off. Yes, that is a pencil you see in the fuel line. Only use a blunt one. You won't want anything to fall into your line. A pencil is a bad but handy choice. I found a 3" by 3/4 by 16 threaded bolt at the house, which in conjunction with the head cutoff of a 5/8 by 5" bolt will remove the primary clutch. If you can't find these, which most people won't, just go out and buy them. Now you're ready to remove the primary clutch. Just remove the original clutch bolt, washer, spacer, and slide in the cutoff 5/8" bolt, and thread the 3/4" bolt in on top of it. Now put as much pressure on it as you easily can. Strike the bolt and it should pop off, just as the flywheel did. Remove the stator now, noting the mark on it and the case for reassembly purposes. You can scribe a line with a scratch awl that will be even more exact. This is your engine timing, so look and mark before removal. Take off the oil pump. There will be an O-ring, 2 shim washers, an outer collar, a washer, and a shaft. Clean and set aside, making notes as to the order for reassembly. Remove the crankcase bolts from the bottom of the motor. Tap in several places with a rubber mallet, or use a ball-peen hammer and block of wood to knock the 2 case halves apart. I've found my problem, and it isn't pretty. Both outer bearings on the PTO or power takeoff end of the crank are destroyed. Why? After some web searching, seems the oil galley you see on the far left is rather small compared to the others, and things have gotten hot, plugging it further with residue. The other bearings seem okay. If the innermost crank bearings are bad, special equipment is needed for rebuilding the crank, and it may not be worth it. I'll test them more when cleaned and oiled. I'm going to wrap the crankshaft to protect it and cut with a Dremel these 2 bad bearings off. I'll put a hose clamp on the crank for protection, and you can see the cuts I'm making. I don't want to cut into the crank at all, just get close, and then I'll crack it off with a cold chisel. Note, there is a spacer between the 2 bearings. If you destroy it, it's cheap, but try to see it and save it. I've determined that the bearings had never totally spun in the case, because there are small pins coming out of them to prevent this. They fit into small notches just below the parting line of the 2 case halves, so the crank itself, although discolored, appears okay, and the area where the seal rides look also to be okay. Inspect and be careful to not damage all parts. Your skill in removing these bearings determines whether this job will be a success. As per web research, I will open the oil galley up to the size of the others with a drill, and also the oil chamber at the end of the galley, which I have darkened, will be slightly machined out with a trusty Dremel. The drawing tells the story, and the process has been completed in this picture. It is cleanup time. Remove all gasket material that sealed the crankcase halves, and anywhere else gaskets didn't fully come off. I washed all parts in solvent and blew them off. I sprayed carb choke cleaner all over them and blew them off again. And finally I rinsed them in hot soapy water and blew them off again. Now I will oil them lightly, the steel parts, with 2-stroke oil. A good time now is to inspect all other parts and determine what parts you'll need. I need for this job a full gasket set including the engine seals, both the PTO side bearings and crankcase sealant. This will run about $125 to $150. Now is a good time to clean up the sled because these parts are rarely in stock. Once you have the parts in hand, study the bearings and spacer and determine the order and position that they go on the shaft. If you get it wrong, you'll have to cut the new bearing off. There are lots of ways to get it wrong, so study it and lay it out exactly. I can't stress this enough. I will heat the bearing in a bath of 2-stroke oil, slightly elevating the bearing in a small tub. I will heat it to 250 degrees. I will have a driver handy to knock the bearing home if necessary. Only hit on the innermost race of the bearing, nothing else. Here you see the new engine seals, crankcase sealant, spacer, and one of the new bearings laid out. I'm chilling the crankshaft. It just happens to be 13 below this afternoon. Here you see the new bearings separated by the spacer, installed. I've installed each bearing individually about 45 minutes apart, heating and chilling each one separately. I'll wipe a little grease on each side of my crank and slide my engine seals on. Don't put them on backward. Now line them up. Place it in the inverted top crankcase. I have it on two small 4x4s so the connecting rods have a place to hang. Install the components for the oil pump that go inside the crankcase. You can agree or disagree with this sealant for the crankcase. The main thing is you must work quickly, use it sparingly, and get the two halves together before it hardens at all. 10 minutes or less is good. The main thing is this sealant will work. In this 10 to 15 minute period, you'll want to get the crankcase halves bolted together and to the correct amount of torque. I've re-oiled all bearings and oil galleys and am now reversing my disassembly. The piston rings are pinned, so be sure to align the end gaps of the rings before pushing the cylinder block down over them. A take-apart ring compressor works good here, but fingers and two people can easily accomplish this task. Just keep going with reassembly, but do check for ease of engine crank rotation. This is done best with the spark plugs out. Notes are always handy. They all come from the web. Study the manual and other people's blog comments. Notice blackened marks on the left side of the stator at the 10 o'clock position and the scribe marks at the 2 o'clock positions. Installation of the recoil starter cup makes for a good item to hold when torquing the flywheel nut and primary clutch bolt. Installation of recoil shroud retainer, engine shrouding, exhaust Y-pipe, and engine mount. Install your outer oil pump. Your assembled engine weighs 71 pounds, so be careful. Let's put it back in the sled. Here is the small wrench that I made to fit that troublesome front left bottom engine mount nut. You have to bleed your oil pump when you've got it put back together and align the marks for proper functioning. Well, the engine looks good. Job completed, but will it start? I will prime it with a little premix down the spark plug holes. Hey, first pull. No kidding. And it's just that easy. Actually, there are 40 man-hours in this project, and that doesn't include web research and parts acquisition. But it does include a meticulous job that, as a postscript, is again riding the trails of Wisconsin and Minnesota. If you try this, it is a challenge, but if all goes well, you can save your snowmobile, learn a few things, and be proud and satisfied with what you have accomplished. Good luck.